Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff. Proud to report that after our hard-hitting reporting last week, the Family Life Center will no longer use plastic communion cups. We have finally made a change. Nobody knows exactly what the change will be to, but nobody will be buying them anymore. We do have about 10,000 of them still in a closet, and we don't really know what the most sustainable way to use them could be, but I think that's a good problem to have.
I'm sure the Sunday school kindergartners can use them for arts and crafts for the next 30 years.
That's right. Yeah, great containers for little tiny amounts of paint.
That's a great point. You can paint all of your great Dungeons and Dragons minis from the communion cups.
That's right, folks. We can't stop talking about trash. It's always trash day here at the Magnificast. At least it was last week, and it is this time again. But we have, I think, some pretty good angles on it. The thing about trash is there's so much of it, and it's so weird, and it is not hard to find really wild things to say about garbage.
That's right. Last week, we talked a little bit about the ways that trash is integral to a growing capitalist economy. If you like a healthy economy, then you fundamentally also have to like trash. So if you want to know more about that particular thesis, you can just hit the back button, go to last week and hear all the things that we had to say. This week, I wanted to take a quick detour. Maybe not a detour, maybe actually a fundamental step in a different direction.
A tour.
Yeah, there's no D about it. It's just a tour. We talked a lot about the sort of economics of trash, and we're going to pick up again on some of that stuff, but we really wanted to also make sure that we are paying attention to our core competency of liberation theology. So we decided that we would take a tour by thinking about what at least one liberation theologian has said about consumption and kind of how it's framed within some theologies of liberation. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about, so many things. We've got some interesting things to say about about coffee pods, about aluminum, about mining, about a very important yet niche economic theory called dependency theory, and then also everyone's favorite, Leonardo Boff. And we're going to talk about some of the big ideas of his 1993 book, Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. Dean, how does that hit you?
Sounds great. The cool Boff is back on the pod.
That's right. We're going to forget the other one for now until he gets cool again. There's still time. You never know. Dean, I'm going to say something right now that I know you're going to be into. Mines, they're so bad. Mining,
I have to agree.
An awful practice. Yeah. Canada is like basically just a handful of mining companies in a trench coat. And they do so much damage all around the world, I'm sad to say. Let me tell you about a specific example of a place where a mine has done something very bad and a mining company has done something really bad for basically a stupid consumptive capitalist reason. So we're going to do a little bit of history, and then I'm going to tell you about how it applies to our lives right now. So in 2015, in the mining town in the state of Minas Gerais, Brazil, there were 2 reservoirs containing the wastewater from an iron mine, and the walls of the reservoir burst. I'm just going to read this bit from a book that's called Living Well at Others' Expense by Stephen Lesnick, because he has all the details here. So here it goes. So the wastewater burst from an iron mine, causing 60 million cubic meters of heavy metal containing mud, enough to fill 25,000 Olympic swimming pools, to flood the neighboring community of Bento Rodrigues and enter the Rio Doce. This was caused by a major earthquake, according to the mine operator San Marco, which is important, and we'll get there in a minute. So the mud flowing out of the reservoir engulfed the surrounding villages and some of their inhabitants. 3/4 of the 853-kilometer-long Sweet River became a toxic mix of iron, lead, mercury, zinc, arsenic, and nickel residues, abruptly cutting off some 250,000 people from access to clean drinking water. After 14 days, the tide of red mud reached the Atlantic coast and flowed out to the ocean, leaving behind a devastated ecosystem. There are so many of these stories throughout the global south, especially in Brazil. There's another one that's very famous from 2019 about the Vale mine. And something very similar happened with mudslides and a huge environmental and human cost. And these stories are surprising in the ways that probably more governmental regulation and so on could have probably stopped them. Because of the ways that capitalism is embedded kind of globally, those types of things are overlooked when it comes to mining companies making a few bucks. So that's an interesting story, you might be saying, but what does this have to do with trash? Let me tell you. The question that we should be asking about those types of huge accidents is probably the wrong word because they are not that accidental if you think about it. The question that we should be asking about those huge catastrophes is, what was all that water doing there in the first place? Like, what is the mine producing that is producing so much, like, awful byproduct? So the mining companies behind this particular one from 2015 are called Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton, who own the mine through a local subsidiary called Samarco. It was primarily an iron mine, but connected to all of this as well is this other type of ore called bauxite. Brazil is like the world's like third biggest producer of this particular type of ore, and it is an ore that is essential to global capitalism, especially the capitalist flows of production that have to do with disposable packaging. So bauxite is the main ore ingredient in things like aluminum, which is an interesting connection because I think this sort of connects a distant mining catastrophe that's happening in a country that's very far away from where most of us live to our direct lives, because we are always consuming things that have at least a little bit of aluminum in them. The global north is directly implicated in this type of tragedy, like whenever it happens, especially in a place like Brazil, and especially when it comes to mining, through at least one extremely stupid consumer good: coffee pods. So Brazil, like I said, it's the world's third biggest producer of bauxite, and that the aluminum that kind of comes out of that process is used for all kinds of consumer goods, whether it's like aluminum foil or other types of electronics or other consumer goods. But the biggest one is coffee pods. So all those coffee pods and all that aluminum, it like adds up quite a bit. So from that same book that I was reading from a minute ago, from Stephen Lesnick, he says that a huge amount of energy is required to produce the aluminum that is used to make the coffee capsules. It takes 14 kilowatts of energy to make 1 kilogram of aluminum from bauxite, releasing 8 kilograms of carbon dioxide in the process, which is a lot. Too much if you think about it. And then he goes on to say that this is not the only reason why the success of the aluminum capsules popularized in advertisements featuring a handsome and world famous actor. I don't really know who he's talking about. If I read the footnote, maybe I would, but I'm not going to at this moment.
Danny DeVito.
You can. I'm sure it was Danny DeVito. Anyways, he really brings it home here, though. He says in 2014, Germany alone consumed 2 million of these coffee capsules, which only a few years later had been completely unknown, and the figure is still rising. So there we have it, folks. There's like a direct connection between an awful disaster in the global south that not only killed lots of people but destroyed an ecosystem, and the global north, the consumption that we do basically every day without even thinking about it. Those two things have a direct connection. It's maybe a bit circuitous, but one cannot happen without the other, right? The type of consumption that we're doing in the global north is directly related to those types of catastrophes. And, our trash is caught up in that as well, right? It's also the case that these aluminum coffee pods are not being recycled. They're going to end up just in the trash in the dump somewhere. And in fact, that's kind of what makes them so appealing to people in the first place, that they are disposable. They're single use. You use them in your weird Nespresso machine or whatever it is that one might have. I'm not saying you. Of course, the listeners of this podcast probably wouldn't do that. Whatever. But you use your coffee capsule and then you chuck it, right? That's kind of the way that it works. So there you go. Lots of energy goes into making the aluminum, and then even more energy goes into making the coffee pod, which releases carbon dioxide, and then all of it goes into the trash. And then meanwhile, the communities in Brazil who are actually doing the work of production are destroyed in a very uncaring way. I guess this is, like, to me, such a important type of story or illustration because it really demonstrates the ways that our trash is kind of caught up in the world more broadly, right? It's not just a thing that we're like throwing away and like, aren't we stupid for being such dumb consumers or whatever, but it's like this whole chain of production that is going on behind the scenes that we probably aren't thinking about when we're, tossing something in the trash.
Yeah, I think to me too, something that comes up when I think about a coffee pod in particular is that when people talk about capitalism, they're often saying it's a system designed to meet people's needs. And the great example of a coffee pod is that nobody actually needs one.
Right.
Coffee pods are not solving a problem, right? Coffee is already pretty disposable, no matter how you make it. Like, there's not a kind of incredible process of like arduous coffee making. I mean, people get nerdy, like they turn coffee into a hobby, I think in part because it is an incredibly routine and very simple, reproducible action that most working people do every single day with like a coffee pot. And they don't have to think about a coffee pod or whatever else, like it's not really even making the process more convenient, but it is selling you on the idea that it's more convenient. And I think what's really important about an example like that is that it's not the meeting of a desire in capitalism, it's the production of a desire. So you see George Clooney and Danny DeVito talking about coffee pods and Nespresso or whatever on TV, and you're like, wow, I could be like both of them. I could be either the George Clooney or the Danny DeVito in my life. And I'll wake up and have a great Nespresso. It'll taste just like an espresso, but it came out of this goofy pod. And that's it. Like, before you see a commercial like that, nobody in the world had ever thought, if only this coffee could be into a compressible pod, then my life would be super improved from whatever it is, my coffee making routine now. And I think that's an important kind of note, because even when degrowth is talking about, reducing our consumption or downscaling consumption and production, people will often be like, that's an austerity program or something like that. And I think the reality is these kinds of things just don't have to exist. Nobody's lives are being improved by coffee pods. And nevertheless, like, there are many people's lives who are being actively destroyed by the necessary inputs that are required to have a coffee pod. I think that's the kind of thing that, should kind of give us pause, I guess.
Yeah, big time. Man, I'm always wondering if I'm the George Clooney or the Danny DeVito, and I think a lot of days it's Danny DeVito. But that's true. When you're too good at capitalism, you have lots and lots of money. It's called a surplus, and you have to figure out something to do with that surplus. And you cannot just take all of that money, take all of that surplus, and put it back into production to make, production super efficient or whatever. You have to just kind of invest it in all kinds of different places. And at least one place is marketing, to make something like a coffee pod seem not only like a good idea, but something that people have to have. So, the money goes to George Clooney and Danny DeVito, and they convince you that it's a good idea to buy the coffee pod. And, whatever, the coffee pod is helpful to capitalism in all kinds of other ways. Like we said last week, that it's disposable is a boon to capitalism, because it's one more thing that you can spend some money on and then people will buy. And, it's a whole nother opportunity to open up more profits through a new product, a new commodity. Before we move on to talking about something else here in a second, though, I just really need to quickly plug this article I found called "Carbon Footprint of Different Methods of Coffee Preparation." This is just kind of like came up in the research. Okay, first of all, here's the funny thing about this article is that they're trying to assess the cradle to grave carbon footprint of coffee preparation and like in all of its complexity. Such a great thing to do, very fun. It kind of, opens up a lot of vantage points on thinking about the ways our lives are consumptive and weird and all this kind of stuff. But what I really like about it is that it is a study that's done by 4 Italian scientists, and you're never going to believe the conclusion that they come to. It's that mocha pots are the most environmentally friendly thing. That's right.
Bravissimo.
The mocha pot that's in your Nona's kitchen is actually the healthiest thing for you and the environment. Very interesting. Yeah, we don't need to talk about the details of that study, but basically, if you are using a mocha pot heated by an induction or gas stove, you're emitting some carbon dioxide into the environment, but it is markedly less if you're using an espresso machine, a capsule machine, or like anything else basically that has copious amounts of packaging materials. So anyways, pretty good if you think about it.
All very interesting. I mean, lots you could say even about coffee as a consumer product and everything else, but interesting to observe some of those considerations. I think the harder parts to parse out are the production side of things. So we get a sense of the consumption side, right? We have these coffee pods that we don't need. Isn't that goofy? Isn't that stupid or silly or whatever? But the tragedy is that not only are they being thrown in a dump or whatever, but as you said at the beginning, Matt, they are facilitating these situations where a huge waste tailings dam will burst and, poison a whole community or kill a bunch of people. a situation that happens quite a lot in the mining industry in the global south. And I think what's really kind of troubling about that is not only that these sort of production sites that are really dangerous or damaging are facilitating useless consumption, but also that it kind of raises questions about how our global economy is constructed. Because you might ask yourself, why would a community in Brazil ever accept basically toxic mine in their community? And, like you might think, well, maybe there's some good economic trade-offs, like whatever, Brazil wants a mine because they want to grow their industrial capacity or whatever. But that's not really what happens. Instead, our global economy is basically a huge system of plunder where the global south organizes its economy, or countries in the global south organize their economies in order to primarily satisfy the kind of consumer demands in the global north, with, certain exceptions for sure, but primarily that's the case. And I think that when I start to think about those kinds of situations, the like moment of, I don't know, guilt or shame you have when you like see a coffee pod is ratcheted up, because you're like, wow, there are like whole economies that, or like whole towns, municipalities in Brazil, let's say, that are making choices based on whether or not a hotel decided to like buy a coffee machine that requires coffee pods or buy a coffee machine that makes coffee in a carafe or whatever. And that is really a wild kind of scale of problem.
Yeah, big time. It demonstrates the way that our economies are really always international. You can do local things, but there's always an international element that's sort of looming just over the horizon. Dean, well, why don't you tell us more about this particular economic theory and the way that it works out with liberation theology?
Right. So we've talked about something called dependency theory on the show at length, and if you listen for a long time or you know a lot about liberation theology, this will not be new material to you. But I do think it's helpful to review and kind of think through every once in a while, because dependency theory is also having a bit of a resurgence in the last few years, 5 or 6 years, I feel. And a few more new books kind of coming out about it. And it seems like there's kind of more interest in, rediscovering what's valuable in that kind of method. It was made popular in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There are different versions of dependency theory. There are Marxist versions, there are non-Marxist versions, there are kind of Keynesian and liberal versions of it. So you don't have to be a Marxist to recognize that in some economies, the decisions that get made are made in such a way that they're determined by fulfilling consumer needs in the north, not by what makes sense for a particular national economy. And I think that's an interesting point even in itself. Like, you don't need dialectical materialism even to figure out, like, wow, there's a huge imbalance here. However, there were some really interesting Marxist versions of it. The basic kind of argument of dependency theory is that the development of the North is made possible by the active underdevelopment of the South. Or another way to put it is that the global South isn't undeveloped, where it's like it just needs to catch up or develop its economy and then one day it will be developed. On the contrary, it's being underdeveloped actively. It's kept underdeveloped so that the North is able to enjoy cheap goods and, commodities that have cheaper labor inputs, all those kinds of bizarre, awful injustices. And the key is that these are two sides of the same coin: development and underdevelopment. It's a global look at the economy. The Latin Americans were pretty big, lots of voices in Brazil, but elsewhere too. And so you can kind of guess why liberation theology might find some interesting voices there. There's a regional similarity. But you can also think about people like Walter Rodney are pulling off this analysis in interesting ways in Africa, or a guy named Samir Amin, an Egyptian scholar, looking at Africa and Asia. Another guy, Walden Bello, looking at the Philippines. The key is that there are all these contextual analyses that show how different national economies are organized to kind of send. Oftentimes, it's like a kind of key commodity export to the global north. So you're not really diversifying your economy. You're developing your own industrial path or your own economic way forward. You're really just kind of ensuring your place in the economic chain, which is one designed to basically keep you poor. Liberation theologians were pretty influenced by that theory on every continent. That it tries to kind of show that liberation from capitalist exploitation would require a break with capitalism, but also the formation of a block of kind of like South countries that support each other. That is a unrealized ambition or aspiration that to this day has not really materialized, but that's maybe part of the the proscriptive piece of it. But for theologians, the key is that dependency theory showed that poverty is not an act of God, but something that has really traceable origins and causes. And it's a sort of call on Christians in the North to step up and do something about their own countries. So you have all these theologians in the global South looking around, reading dependency theory, recognizing in it that there's a story being told about their own countries that makes sense. And when you kind of go in front of the pulpit and you start talking to, your parishioners or whatever, the key is not to be like, and you should just accept that. Like Brazil is being organized to satisfy the needs of the North. On the contrary, there's an assumption that the Christian task is to recognize that that's unjust and then try to build a movement capable of breaking out of that unjust kind of structure or cycle. So I guess to bring it full circle, the dependency theory is the kind of theory that's trying to make sense of why a community in Brazil feels the need to have a mine that could be toxic. And to be clear, it's not like communities are actually consulted and they say, yes, that sounds good, you should do that. That almost never happens. Maybe a better way of putting it would be like, why would state authorities in Brazil agree to have a mine there or something like that? And dependency theory wants to say it's because the countries feel sort of locked into this pattern of satisfying those consumer needs. And on the other side, consumer needs or desires in the global North, they prompt the expansion of really dangerous industries like the extractive industry. And they go around the world looking for ways to kind of benefit from the hyper-exploitation of people in the planet. So it's a kind of theory that's trying to make sense of the connection between a coffee pod and a busted mine, to say that this is not just like an accident or not the result of people being greedy or shitty, even if they are those things. It's a result of this kind of like systemic compulsion to integrate your economy into these extremely weird consumer capitalist economies that have developed in the North.
Yeah, man. Dependency theory is such an interesting thing. I feel like it is really helpful for getting through some of like the fundamental capitalist mythology. I mean, and some of that fundamental capitalist mythology is also the reason why a country like Brazil would let their industrial policy be like toxic mines. Talk to like one capitalist ever, and they will tell you basically the same thing, that capitalism is good because it pulls people out of poverty, right? Because it transforms an economy into one that has a place in the industrial world system or whatever. But this is kind of what dependency theory is trying to debunk. Accepting toxic mine as part of the industrial strategy of Brazil is not the road to Brazil becoming more like the United States or something, right? It's not like the accepting that as an industrial policy is not going to transform Brazil into a more affluent and consumerist society. It's going to lock them into a particular place in the production of commodities in the world system. Does capitalism bring people out of poverty? Probably not. It locks them into a particular productive space, ensuring that they never develop, that they stay, they stay in it as an underdeveloped quote unquote country or something, for the sake of the consumption of the global North.
Yeah, and I think that it is helpful too to figure out like what's the point of having that analysis. And I think the more you look at people who argue against dependency theory, on the right at least, there are some legitimate arguments or debates on the left about it. Maybe we could talk about that. But on the right, the more you look at those kind of objections, the more you see exactly like what the alternative interpretation of the world has to be. And for example, I've been reading, for no real reason, Michael Novak's old stuff on liberation theology. He was a guy in the US, an extremely weird person. He was a Democrat, but loved Ronald Reagan. That was his whole brand. He was basically a Republican, except that he, called himself Democrat. And he made it his mission to discredit liberation theology or to argue against it. And he wrote several books about it. He wrote a book called Will It Liberate? That's his most direct confrontation. He wrote another one called The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, just kind of like his theology of capitalism. So anyway, I've been reading these books and just becoming mad at night by myself. But there's a really wild moment in it where he's talking about dependency theory. And he's like, yeah, these liberation theologians, they say Brazil is dependent on the US and other economies. But there's no reason that Brazil couldn't have just developed its industry and its capacity, just like how the US developed its industry and capacity. It's just a fact that Brazil didn't do that. And it's wild because he stops just short of basically being like, and that's because they're an inferior people or stupid or unproductive or whatever. And it's interesting because like the alternative view of the global economy, where you kind of take for granted the capitalist pull yourself up by your bootstraps model, it ultimately has to cash out by saying whole populations are essentially incapable of like thinking economically, or there's no externality that prevents people from just doing capitalism. This is a choice that's been made, and so much the better for the US, but everybody could basically make that choice. And it's a fundamentally racist argument, right? It's like the people of Brazil are bad and dumb, their leaders are bad and dumb, and that's why they don't have, material prosperity. And dependency theory wants to say, well, that's not true at all. Brazilian economics are shaped by being locked into that kind of global capitalist pattern. And even when countries have tried extremely hard to break out of it, Brazil being a very specific case where they had instituted a policy of import substitution, and they were working really hard based on dependency theory to build their own productive capacities. They had a right-wing military coup that stopped all that stuff and then kind of forced Brazil back into those global chains, the commodity chain, and so on. And Brazil is like a very big country that tried to do that. There are lots of smaller countries that try to do it and get punished as well. And I think the key piece is to say, like, you're basically stuck between a rock and a hard place. You either accept your place in the chain, or you try to break out of it and wait to get disciplined by the powers that want you to, know your place in the chain. And by framing it either as a struggle, if you're a dependency theorist, or a kind of, I don't know, like result of your biological stupidity if you're like a right-wing capitalist, I think that kind of framing makes all the difference. So you can see why liberation theologians, for example, picked up on dependency theory, even though weird, unintelligent people like Michael Novak disingenuously read all that.
Cool. Well, let's pivot a bit here then, and let's talk more about the liberation theology stuff kind of going on here. So, like you said a minute ago, liberation theologians, they're interested in dependency theory, especially the liberation theologians that are in Latin America and in Africa and Asia. All of them that aren't in North America, I guess. They're interested in dependency theory because it demonstrates that poverty is not an act of God, right? That there's sort of a material reason for poverty, and that material reason is capitalism, right? So that's like the milieu that liberation theology is coming out of. Having that economic backing is important for Christians in the global north, like us, who are interested in liberation theology, because you can read liberation theology and get all kinds of things from it. But I feel like if you're bringing a lot of your global north assumptions to it, like without the dependency theory stuff going on in the background, without kind of understanding the economics of liberation theology, you might just end up taking away like, the idea that liberation theologians are kind of telling you like there are some radical ideas in the Bible or something, which is true. I mean, and fine. But what's going on here is that there are some radical ideas in the Bible, but also the ideas that they're talking about from liberation theology are about more than just the ideas in the Bible. It's about sort of a different economic order, one where people in the global north have to live in a different sort of way to make room for people in the global south. Going through all the economic theory that's going on in the background is actually really important because it takes what you read in liberation theology and it makes it, I think, make more sense within the context of economics and social inequality and stuff like that. So one liberation theologian who does this quite a bit is Leonardo Boff. There are others who talk about consumption in the global north. Gutierrez does it. Balisaria does it. Liberation theologians are not like are not shy about talking about consumption and talking about this relationship of dependency that we're laying out here. But the way that Leonardo Boff does it in his book, Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, and in a few other books too, I think is particularly helpful because he is writing kind of with all this dependency theory kind of happening in the background, but he's also writing with a sort of eye towards ecology, which I think is quite important and also part of this conversation. He was writing in the 90s, so that conversation looked a tad bit different than it does in 2025. The innovation, I think, in this Boff book is that he is not just like stating the fact that the global north is consuming too much or whatever, but he's writing with that audience in mind, at least somewhat. And he frames that all that consumption as not only a material problem, but it's also a real spiritual problem for Christians in the global north.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about Boff on all that is that, as you said, he's writing this in the 90s. He's pretty ahead of his time. I mean, the ecological movement, it's not like it started in the 90s. It's been around for a long time. But when it comes to liberation theology and ecology, it took kind of a while, maybe surprisingly or not, for liberation theologians to take ecology as a fundamental theme. And obviously it's had influence because even the title of the book, Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, it makes its way into a line in Laudato Si where Pope Francis says that we have to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. So, I mean, he doesn't cite Boff. I don't know why, but it's obviously a nod to Boff. And that to me feels pretty significant. The more interesting thing maybe is like how relevant that what might have felt like a forward-looking thing in the 90s, how relevant that is still today, 3 decades later. That unfortunately the kind of warnings that Boff was already making 30 years ago have not really been listened to or heard. And it's kind of our duty now, I think, as degrowth is becoming a big conversation, to find a different way to hear all that stuff today.
Yep, I think that makes sense. Here, I'm going to read this bit from Leonardo Boff and we can kind of work through some of these ideas. So this is, again, from Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. Boff writes, "The astronauts have accustomed us to see the Earth as a blue and white spaceship floating in space, bearing the common fate of all beings. Actually, on this spaceship Earth, 1/5 of the population is traveling in the passenger section. They consume 80% of the supplies for the journey. The other 4/5 are traveling in the cargo hold. They suffer cold, hunger, and all kinds of hardships. They're slowly becoming aware of the injustice of this distribution of goods and services. They plan rebellion. Either we die passively of hunger or we make changes that will benefit everyone, they say. It's not a difficult argument. Either we all are saved in a system of participatory common life and solidarity with and on Spaceship Earth, or in an explosion of wrath we could blow up the ship, sending us all falling into the abyss. Such an awareness is on the rise and can be terrifying." This is an ecological insight, especially with the Spaceship Earth language, that will kind of come more out the more we talk about Boff, I think. But this is also the situation of dependency, right? There's a group of people on the spaceship who are very small, a global minority, if you will, and they are consuming most of the supplies. Meanwhile, everyone else just kind of like has to deal with it. So this is like an illustration that is kind of Boff uses it in more than one book, and not like he's self-plagiarizing, but it's an illustration he returns to kind of time and time again to describe like exactly the situation on Spaceship Earth and exactly who's doing the consuming. But I think that this particular framing is really interesting and starts getting into some of Boff's quirks, but also some of like the power of this particular rhetoric. A lot of Boff's ecological thinking, especially in this book, in Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, and in a few of his other books too, is really based on like this type of like ecological thinking that was very popular, especially in the early 90s, called the Gaia hypothesis. We don't need to go into all of it, but I will say really briefly that so there's this like scientist who's actually a pretty weird guy named James Lovelock. He's a weird guy because he was also into cryonics and like freezing mice and stuff and then bringing them back to life. So anyways, he came up with this idea that's called the Gaia hypothesis. And basically it's the idea that the Earth is like one big living organism that is synergistic and self-regulating. That's the Earth, right? And humans are sort of like within this big synergistic and self-regulating system that is the Earth. Lovelock is just like a scientist. He's not like a spiritual kind of guy, but there is a spiritual type of quality that Boff, I think, then reads into this particular type of thing. All that to say that type of idea is sort of in the background of Boff's thinking, that the spaceship Earth is like, it's like this one big superorganism that we are all a part of, which is not incompatible with Christianity or anything, but just it is, and it's a funny quirk of the whole thing, I think.
It is. I think we've said before that one big difference between Leonardo Boff and Clodovus Boff, back when Clodovus was cool, he was more of a systematic thinker. And Leonardo Boff is definitely a weirder kind of thinker, or a more new agey or mystical kind of thinker. He's more theologically adventurous or promiscuous than Clodovus. And maybe, to be fair, Leonardo Boff is still committed to liberation theology and Clodovus is not. So maybe there's something to it. But I think that, it is like challenging rhetoric in some ways, especially if you're like a materialist. And also, I guess, if you're a particular kind of Christian. But I think what Boff is trying to get at, he was also a Franciscan priest. I think he's trying to express that there has to be some more connected kind of Christian spirituality, more porous to the world. And the Gaia hypothesis is one way of kind of seeing creation as an active and living thing rather than like an inert set of resources and materials. And I think that's also something that feeds into Boff's other criticisms of the way that we organize the Earth and the economy on the Earth. I'll read another quote from the same book. He says, 2 major issues will occupy the minds and hearts of humankind from now on. What is the destiny and future of planet Earth if the logic of pillage to which the present type of development and consumption that we've become accustomed to continues? What hope is there for the poor 2/3 of humankind? There's a danger that the culture of the satisfied will become enclosed in its consumeristic selfishness and cynically ignore the devastation of the poor masses of the world. There's also a danger that the new barbarians will not accept their death sentence. New barbarians is in quotes, by the way. Will not accept their death sentence and will set out on a desperate struggle for survival, threatening everything and destroying everything. Humankind may find itself facing violence and destruction at levels never seen before on the face of the earth, unless we collectively decide to change the course of civilization and shift its thrust from the logic of means at the service of an exclusionary accumulation toward a logic of ends serving the shared well-being of planet Earth, human beings, and all beings in the exercise of freedom and cooperation among all peoples. And I think, you might think, well, you don't need the Gaia hypothesis to get there. And I think that's true. I don't really like it myself and I don't want it.
Sure, fair enough.
But I think it's interesting, though, that, what Boff is trying to do is say, we have a story about the world that we tell, which is that it is just waiting to be exploited and extracted and turned into capital accumulation. And unless we change that story, whether it's to something like the Gaia hypothesis or something else, we're probably going to keep on doing that. And I think that there's a real strength in liberation theology's attention to the narratives that we tell that organize the world. I think what Marxists usually do by kind of analyzing the economic realities of the world and then sort of being like, our narratives are on top of that, or all you got to do is parse out the economic logic underneath and everything else will kind of find its place. You can get pretty far with that sort of analysis. And I think that it is kind of an interesting thought experiment to do, but it is just a thought experiment. It's not like the true science, despite certain Marxists on the internet. And there's a dialectical relationship between economic models and the stories that we tell about them. And what I like about Boff is he's trying to invite, especially people in the North, to find a different story, one that isn't about consumption and accumulation, but is about maybe trying to, be in a healthier relationship with the planet.
Yep, exactly. So I guess moving things along here with Boff, well, he's telling us the problem. He's telling us what's going wrong on Spaceship Earth. But the answer to the good Lendis question of what must be done in Boff is not complicated. Well, it might be complicated in practice, but here, I'll just read it. I'll stop talking and I'll just read it. He says that it's not only the poor and the oppressed who must be liberated, but it's all human beings, rich and poor, because all are oppressed by a paradigm, abuse of the earth, consumerism, denial of otherness, and the inherent value of each being that enslaves us all. And then he says, we all must seek a paradigm that will enable Gaia to live and all beings in creation, especially human beings, to exist in solidarity. I agree with you, Dean, that I'm not a big fan of the Gaia stuff either. It's fine that Boff is. I feel like there is like a Franciscan sort of like reading of that maybe makes it a bit more palatable to me. But whatever. I mean, either way, whether you want to think of the Earth as as a big superorganism or something, or if you just want to think about the sort of like spiritual connection between all human beings or something, you have your human siblings and also like brother wolf and sister bodily death or whatever, all the good Franciscan things. But you can kind of see sort of like a similar type of logic that there is an exclusionary type of life that we are sold through consumerism, through corporations, hiring marketers, knowing how to press our buttons so that we want to buy the coffee pod rather than let other people live a life of like dignity and sufficiency. That is fundamentally bad. We need to be liberated from that. Boff goes on to say a few more things that are like even less sort of beating around the bush, and maybe not even less word mincy, I guess. But he says this later, or actually, this is a quote that comes earlier in the book, but we're getting to it around now because it's maybe a cool concluding idea. Boff says that the ecological crisis means two basic imbalances in society: too much consumption by the rich and too little consumption by the poor. It means the global crisis of the life system, from the destruction of forests, the spread of urban neuroses, to the contemporary indifference towards the drama of millions of starving people. And this is a hard one to stomach: the nihilism of heavy rock music that excites the youth. But I think this is good because this is demonstrating like, okay, Boff is recognizing a material problem that has a fundamentally spiritual element to it, the type of like alienation and disconnection that people in consumption intensive societies have with the earth and with other people, so much so that we would let people in another community like drown in a toxic sludge and not really bat an eye about it so that we can have coffee pods. And then the material answer is that you have to consume less, and that's it. You have to consume less so other people can consume a little bit more, so that we can kind of like get out of that dependency cycle where some economies are basically there to structure and support the consumption of people elsewhere in the world who just like have the luxury of living in a different place, have the dumb accidental luck of just like living in a different place. There's a particular arc to that type of thinking that I think is really helpful. That it's a material problem, it's a spiritual problem. It helps you recontextualize your place in it all as well, like that you yourself can't sort this out. This is like a big problem, and you can open yourself up to it in all kinds of spiritual ways, and thinking about solidarity and how you relate to other people and like the place that you have in the world. But fundamentally, like whether or not you use the super sustainable mocha pot endorsed by 5 Italian scientists, or if you use the Nespresso. I mean, like those are, I guess, important questions for you to figure out, sort of existentially and spiritually, I guess. But this is like a global system that you have to organize against, sort of in a different way than just consumer choices.
Yeah, and I think that's the hardest thing, at least for me specifically, to deal with. I feel like I wish that I could just stop consuming, because I really don't mind living in like a permanent Lenten situation. But the worst part is, like, even if you do that and you are miserable and you make other people miserable around you, you won't solve the problem of of capitalist supply chains. You're just like gonna be a bummer. And that's an important consideration as well, is to like balance out trying to figure out how to live your life in a way that feels morally authentic to you, and also not being just like a stick in the mud because you specifically cannot like take down capitalism by denying yourself treats or whatever. I think that there is a kind of dialectical relationship there too, where the more you deny yourself treats in front of others, not in like a morally pious way or in a way that imposes it on others, but in a way that kind of like challenges that, the more you create a little bit of space for people to like consider the cost of consumption. But I really think the key is to make the even harder move of like transcending your own moral purity to be like, well, how do I effectively build a movement that would be capable of like, saying that maybe we should just not have coffee pods at all. Like, what would it mean to make a movement that's capable of actually planning our economic development in a way that doesn't depend on hurting other people in Brazil or the Congo or something else, just so that we can have, I don't know, like an extremely marginal amount of convenience that basically doesn't matter. I think that's the much more difficult piece.
Yeah, big time. I have been a part of more than one church conversation that's been like, okay, we need to buy coffee for the coffee hour at church. But we want to buy fair trade coffee because that is better, for the people making it, and it's more sustainable for the environment. Somebody will say at church, and then someone else will be like, yeah, okay. But even fair trade coffee is bad for all these other reasons. And, to brew it, you need to buy these paper products, and then we need to make sure that we're also composting it. And like, these are all fine conversations to have at church. Don't let me dissuade you from having them at all. But like, there's an unproductive rabbit hole that you can go down when you like are obsessing about moral purity and not thinking about the ways that like, how could you actually just like make your life more tied to the people who are doing that work, or like, how can you make your life a problem or something for or for the companies that like that do that work. So I don't know. It's a complicated set of like feelings and emotions when we are like embroiled in this stuff directly. It's hard to kind of disentangle our the emotive part of us from it all. But it's the moral purity thing is a conversation worth having with yourself, I think, like every day, probably. But it is one that is like fundamentally a dead end if you're not doing the other side of things, thinking about the global systems of capitalism.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you do it, we won't spend any of it on even one coffee pod. That is the Magnificast guarantee. Our music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night.